Okay, so we're going to dive straight in, and this will be because I am a generalist, so a slightly kind of high-level generalist conversation. So please excuse me for not getting into the nuts and bolts of open source here, but we've got a lot of quite significant policy and finance issues to tackle in the next 41 minutes. So this one is to you, Mark. As we consider the knotty challenge of building an effective open source infrastructure, in your experience, do you think governments fully understand the open source ecosystem?
Oh, well, that was a tough one. The answer is it depends on the government, and the answer is largely no.
Okay. Would you like to say a bit more about that? What's the evidence for that? Okay, there we go.
I think,
evidence.
You know, obviously, to speak of what? 195 members of the United Nations, just to use that as a baseline. To say that all of them have equal knowledge about anything begs the question. I think that actually there are governments, parts of governments that understand it very well. I think ironically, one of the governments that understands it best is the US government. And people will be surprised that the US government has actually been using open source software for its critical infrastructure since 2001, 2002. For a variety of reasons, it went in that direction. But to say that you use it doesn't mean you understand the ecosystem. And I think that's the question you're getting at. Mm-hmm. I think they understand it as a consumer, largely, which is not inappropriate. I mean, the US federal IT budget is the largest in the world of any IT budget. I would also say that in terms of broader issues, you know, I think I see the European Commission, the UK government understanding the role that open source plays in developing new businesses, new jobs, new services pretty well. Mm-hmm. I actually think the government of India understands it pretty well. Mm-hmm. I think that they have seen open source as a way to diversify their global services that they provide. That's just very rough, and obviously there are generalizations, but largely governments don't understand it, and the ones that do really come at it from just one vector.
Right. There was an interesting point made in one of the talks that I heard this morning, actually, about how, you know, quite often the assumption is in the West that we kind of have a sort of a higher order of kind of knowledge and possibly openness, actually, and that just simply isn't the case. So the India example was quite interesting. Do you think that the West is, sorry to use very commercial language, but losing its competitive advantage? Or did it ever happen?
Wow, that's a big question.
I did say we were going to do high level in this.
Of course, that question is way beyond just open source software and software generally. So I think, look, the reality is that for the 40 years after World War II, the West was dominant in everything, right? Obviously, the breakdown of a variety of things has led to. I do think we are diversified globally on the competition front. Increasingly. Some of the best ideas come out of places you wouldn't have thought of, 20 years ago. So I do think I would say the West no longer has the hegemony of ideas anymore about what to do best. But they're still a player, but they don't have the hegemony they once did of where good ideas come from.
Yeah, I guess that's reassurance for some of the people in the room at least. Rebecca, I'm going to come to you next because developers are very much in your community of interest at Rust particularly. And I'm just wondering, what do you feel needs to change in the relationship to make that open source infrastructure, the relationships between policymakers, developers? We talked about intermediaries in our briefing call on Friday, and I wonder what your perspective is on what needs to change in that ecosystem.
I think there needs to be a huge increase in diversity and a far more kind of permeable membrane between what you consider a maintainer community and a policy community and a political community. I think people need to move between these spaces a bit more to truly understand them, which is why, career politicians, for example, are never going to have the kind of understanding that people that have kind of jumped between different sectors. The other thing is that, going back to what Mark was saying, there's an awful lot of other people in the world now that are just, if not more, innovative as those of us in the West, and they're going to be approaching these kinds of problems that we're looking at with new ideas and different ways of thinking. And we need to be quite open to those, because I feel that we do tend in some of these communities to be quite closed, and we've made snap judgments about things that, you know, for better or worse, might not be the best things to kind of stick to. You know, you look at different technologies like blockchain and cryptocurrency. There's a tendency in certain sections, especially, you know, people that are very educated, people very white, people in the Western world, to say, that's all a scam, we shouldn't even be looking at those things. But if you're from Venezuela or, you know, Zimbabwe or somewhere where your central banks have completely, you know, your economic system has completely failed, maybe those are places where innovation is happening differently, and those are places where actually these solutions are taken much more seriously. And with the right investment, you know, maybe the solutions that come from those places, because people have different lived experiences, can be beneficial for everyone. So I think we need to be a lot more open about that. And in terms of, you know, increasing the diversity of the maintainer and the contributor community, investing in trying to bring those people in, rather than, you know, having some, you know, Western people kind of just sat here going, no, we know best. I think it's powerful.
Different ways of quantifying value. You know, I wonder whether there's something there. We certainly feel this in the open data world, that, you know, the notion of social value, and actually indeed the private, you know, this just doesn't relate to government, it relates to the private sector as well. This idea of businesses as sponsors of society, you know, I wonder whether there's some of that, because I just don't see as much evidence of that thinking having taken hold in governments as I might have expected, you know, when we embarked on the journey that we're on at the Open Data Institute 10 years ago. I just wonder whether there are any comparisons to be drawn in the open source world around that.
Well, I mean,
go for it.
If I can kind of jump.
Please do.
I'm really glad that you talk about diversity in open source, and linked to the previous point about how much we understand open source. I think there's an increasing understanding of the value of open source, which is patchy, and that exists in government as it does in industry. But having researched and compiled masses of data about open source and its interdependence is one of it. There is a huge diversity problem, and it is, you know, we're currently at the whims of free innovation. And for me, I think one of the best things that can happen is that we can start to move towards a mode of work in which open source has better financial support, better support with tooling, and we can actually bring a new generation from new geographies that haven't really had the advantages that a generation of people who, let's face it, 15 years ago, were not kingmakers of industry as they are now in software development. And that we can also talk about, you know, diversity in terms of the skills that currently exist in open source. I know, and there is an understandable kind of situation in which developers have centralized themselves in processes that they build around themselves because they're using their time, their free time, that they build themselves into the core of those projects, and they shut out other people, whether it's, you know, people translating, whether it's people that are, you know, working on documentation, just bringing, you know, diversity in terms of geographies and diversity in terms of skills into open source is a real, that's a real kind of benefit for me. And I think, you know, we might not be talking about growth in the UK anymore. I don't know what's happening politically, but that's really like the big opportunity for me. And I think as much as we've spoken about, and I will shut up in a second, security and risk and so on, I think there's another story that we can tell, which is about growth, and it is about, you know, lifting a new generation of open source maintainers and contributors, and those people not just being software developers, that we should also kind of talk more about. So
it's interesting because one of the panels that I heard earlier on today, there was a comment about, I think the panelists were asked to reflect on the one thing that they would do, or the one piece of advice maybe that they would give to policymakers. And the advice was, look and learn at what's going on elsewhere. You know, there was an observation that here in the UK, it feels quite closed still. So I wonder if we could maybe talk about that a little bit with you, Jim, as well, and this sort of whole notion of growth and, you know, the role that sort of the collective plays in that, that perhaps the Commons plays in that, and just your thoughts and observations on that, and, you know, what the benefits might be of the UK potentially, because I am going to focus on the UK a bit now, kind of opening its doors and its eyes a bit to the opportunity. I'm thinking about the policymakers now rather than the developer community.
Yeah, I think, you know, the point that I think you're referring to the last panel where they talked about education being a big opportunity for policymakers, both from a security perspective, but also from a technical competitive perspective. Well, one thing I've noticed about policymakers here in the UK, also in the European Union, is they tend to focus on individual technical issues around privacy, digital sovereignty, trade competitiveness. A lot of the work in the US tends to be at a system level. How do we fix the distribution mechanisms for open source? How do we provide cyber resiliency? Like, that's where a lot of the policy focus right now is. Some of the interesting things I see policymakers in other parts of the world doing that I think are pretty compelling include Israel. So Israel is a good example where being in cybersecurity in Israel is super cool. Like, it's a part, which you can't do in the UK, but they require military service there. Cybersecurity training is actually a part of that service.
Okay.
Over, I think it's 48% of all investment in cybersecurity startups has been in Israeli companies. The amount of capital created there, the amount of education, the resiliency of that workforce was led by government policy and has created cybersecurity from a problem to actually accretive. So that, I think that's a good example of where policymakers can help in build an educated community. I agree with Ben and Rebecca as well. You know, the Linux Foundation spends a ton of time trying to, and this is another thing policymakers can do in terms of growing the community, trying to pair developers from underrepresented parts of the world, Africa, South America, people who have economic, you know, don't have economic means to go get education in a traditional way. By pairing someone with a mentor from an open source project, where they get to learn from some of the best technologists in the world, our job placement rate has been almost 100%. Like in our Linux kernel mentoring programs, if you can land a patch in the kernel as a mentee in our programs, 100% of the time you're going to get a job. And so I think more programs like that would be a good policy.
So there has to be an infrastructure piece, basically, and it might be a regulatory piece or a legal piece or a policy piece, that there has to be some pro-action somewhere. Ben, you were...
I was just going to say, for me, that is, it's beneficial in both directions as well. Like, that open source maintainer is learning a set of skills that they otherwise may not be, you know, learning, may not be exposed to and stuff. So we do quite a lot trying to encourage maintainers to take opportunities to, you know, educate themselves in various kind of issues they might need to manage in terms of governance, some in terms of security, and just trying to kind of like increase access to those opportunities as well. So it really is like bi-directional benefit there.
In theory and at an ecosystem level, that sounds fantastic. But as you've observed, Ben, we're in a country where, you know, we're I mean, the whole world is facing, you know, real hardship and economic turmoil as a result of all sorts of things, the pandemic and, you know, the war in Ukraine and conflicts escalating all the way around the world. In the face of those kinds of macro effects, how do we persuade governments, any government, to invest in open source and in open source infrastructure? To say, you know, given all of the other things that they've got that they have to, all the other decisions they have to make, you know, where here in the UK we've got clamouring for, you know, increases in our publicly provided benefits, you know, quite rightly people are saying that we need to support those who are struggling the most in society and, you know, new Chancellor trying to balance the books. How do we make the case that this is one of those things that that government, that policymakers absolutely should be looking to invest in now? Mark, I'm going to come to you, if that's okay.
So I don't think there's a uniform answer across all governments. I think you start with what are the challenges the particular government's trying to address. I spend most of my time, not all my time, thinking about cybersecurity in the US and the EU context. There, despite all the expressions of concern about open source, I think there's a growing realization that from a long-term resiliency point of view, open source is the better approach. I mean, for those of you who are around 10 or 20 years ago, I mean, it's a very different kind of conversation about the security of open source than it was back then. I do think that what I see from a governmental point of view is just the lack of people who understand how to manage it, but that's true of all software, how to support it, and how to work with teams that can enable them to do it. There's still very much an old-fashioned IT, we're going to buy it, they'll take care of it, that kind of approach, to way too much IT right now. And I think that is shifting. I think it's a generational issue. I think it's also a practical issue, both from a cost as well as just the flexibility of being able to provide updated services to citizens and everything else. So I do think that one of the first things that can happen is, and I think OSPO is one way to do it, but I think you've got to get more open source experienced folks into CISO offices and to IT procurement. And that is probably the simplest, but it by no means easy, first step to do.
Rebecca, you were nodding in agreement there. Thoughts?
Yeah. There needs to be, I think Andy from ARM was saying it on his panel earlier. I think there needs to be an explanation to some of the corners of government that just don't quite get it, that these are the consequences if we don't invest. The UK is already somewhat diminished, I think we can agree, over the last few years. One poor decision after another has really hit our standing in the world. All we hear about is growth and all of these keywords, but we're putting ourselves in an incredibly vulnerable position if we're not going to invest in this. And it's not a case of we just need to invest in security. We absolutely do. But we need to invest in growing a generation of people that understand this, because this needs, an understanding of how the digital world works needs to be far more kind of embedded across our curriculum. We should not just be assuming that anyone that has an interest when they're 16 in computer science, those people will all take care of it once they grow up, because you're going to end up with a really, homogenous kind of group of people. We need to be making sure that there are roles in open source, in government, that recognize this, that champion a lot of the skill sets that are currently missing from open source. People earlier, we've talked about the lack of documentation, the lack of project management. There's loads of skills that are really desperately needed in open source that, at the moment are lacking because there's not enough people, full stop. And the only people there are the people that actually, they just want to code. We need to make this whole kind of sphere far more attractive and welcoming to people that kind of believe in this, but for one reason or another don't want to be an engineer.
Again, it comes back to the whole ecosystem approach, doesn't it? You did touch on, we were talking about funding and, and I guess what I'd like to move on to is the sort of different potential models that we might use. And one thing that I wanted to, and I don't want to put anybody on the spot, so if you don't feel comfortable talking about this, then please let me know. But obviously Germany's introduced a sovereign tech fund, partly as a change in response to US policy under the previous president. And I wonder what your views are as a panel on how useful or not that might be in the UK. Ed?
I mean, from my perspective, there's no approach that isn't useful at this point. And I'm, I see a lot of different
Throw the
funding
kitchen
models.
sink at it.
No, I mean this genuinely, right? So my organisation houses like 3,000 open source projects, and we provide a service to those projects because we have some beliefs about how we think projects should use money as another incentive structure for open source. But we then see the effects of all of the support that comes into those projects. So they'll be from corporations, they'll be from governments, they'll be from individual developers. We see the gamut of what's happening in open source OSPOs and so on and so forth. And at the moment, everything is welcome. I would prefer there to be a bit more of a conversation about what do we see as a representative kind of reciprocal exchange of value? Like, what is the right amount for organizations to give back? And I don't mean just in terms of money, I mean in terms of resource more generally. But yeah, like for me, there's genuinely nothing that is wrong. I think Germany's approach is an approach that is based on them being a user of open source software. And I think that they feel like there's a responsibility as a sovereign state to look after the infrastructure that they depend upon. But yeah, for me, there's no like wrong approach right now. So,
Jim, any views on the German model, or indeed any?
I'm not super familiar with the German model, so I have to confess.
No, but I kind of knew that when I threw, but that might be possible when I threw.
But I agree with Ben. I think more support is better. I mean, I do think the capital markets are pretty efficient on this one. There's a huge, if you look at move the needle kind of money. I mean, Mark Company was acquired by IBM for $34 billion. That's just one open source company. In the past couple of years, $24 billion in private equity investment has happened in open source specific related companies. So there is a huge amount of capital flowing. I think the question comes down to where there are inefficiencies in the market. These projects that have sort of unintentionally become critical to society, and you have a developer who is straining under the workload of waking up one morning and finding out that OpenSSL secures the internet, or their particular JavaScript project has almost overnight become popular, and now they've got this huge support request. Being able to very efficiently funnel capital to those folks, I think is a bit of a failure. But honestly, it's hard to figure it out, because for most well-functioning open source projects, the economic structure is a pretty positive feedback loop of an open source project upstream that creates value in solving a tough technical problem. Let's say that we'll use the Linux kernel or Kubernetes as an example. That's then used to create products that run Amazon's cloud and Google's search. And then they reinvest back in the upstream project in the form of engineers who are fixing bugs they found in production at large hyperscale that are contributing resources. I don't think they contribute enough docs, so I think they're onto something there. Developers hate doing doc writing. But that sort of project to product to profit to project reinvestment is pretty similar. The sort of broken down open source projects where they suddenly became popular or for some happenstance are a part of technical debt on the internet are very Tolstoy-esque. They are uniquely miserable in their own way, and it is hard to figure out an anti-pattern or a pattern in general, either way. So I think trying everything is pretty good. Some of the panelists previously have talked about, there's no silver bullet. I totally agree. No one's claiming silver bullet on any of this. We should try lots of things to effectively allocate capital to the folks who are doing a lot of the work.
I mean, I guess that kind of experimentalism, fail fast kind of mentality is, again, quite a challenge for a government and administration that might consider itself to be in crisis.
If I can adjust my response, because having thought about it a little bit, I will say, so what do we see in the world right now? We see a lot of money going to the kinds of projects that have storied leaders, or they have good branding, or they have, a lot of cool within a certain community. So we could all kind of point out the kinds of projects I'm talking to. And I think the reason for that happening is that at the moment, a lot of industry is investing in supporting open source on the basis of employee retention, hiring, and marketing. So, I mean, I don't want to be negative, but if there is a wrong way of thinking about where you should invest in open source, that's currently creating a marketplace of competition between open source projects, and I think that's not necessarily beneficial. So
I totally agree with that, actually, because one of the things that so I like thinking about, I used to work for the Big Lottery Funding, Big Lottery Fund 20 years ago, so funding non-profits was kind of just my full-time job, which was amazing. But one thing I've always noticed, for, looking at any kind of certainly government funding agency, is that they always want something new and shiny. Mm-hmm. They absolutely do not want to pay you to do the thing that you do really well. You should keep doing that for free, but because you're good at that, then definitely give us something new. So that is, I think, the wrong, and I think it kind of builds on what Ben was saying, that's definitely the wrong thing to do. The other thing with open source is that you need to funnel money towards some of the utterly thankless tasks. The people that do the moderation. I mean, oh my God, what a horrible, horrible role to have. You're basically just volunteering to have difficult conversations with people. Yeah. But you absolutely need that. You need those structures. The problem with kind of just having funds that again, identify sexy, shiny new things to give to maintainers, is that you miss all of that out. It's like open source trying to paint a house. It's like you've got lots and lots of money for 20 people to paint the front door, but you've got no one that's painting the back wall. Because there's no coordination amongst the corporations, the government, and anyone else that's coming to the party. On who's going to do what, because we need to get the whole house done. Yeah. Sorry, that's a tortured metaphor.
We used to talk about the internet, or the web actually, as being the Wild West. And what you've just described, I mean, I can't imagine two different metaphors than a house and the Wild West, but it kind of feels a bit like that. Is that how it feels when you're in it? Mark?
So, maybe I've just been around too long. I think it's less of a Wild West than it used to be honest with you. I mean, just by way of background, I was part of the U.S. government team that negotiated the transition from U.S. government to ICANN. That was the Wild West, okay? We didn't even know where all the root servers were. That was a terrifying time. I mean, this issue of funding, I know we get wrapped up in it. Everyone wants money. I want money. I'd like to have more money. But and I promised I don't want to break the trend of mentioning Mark Cox's name, because I will have to mention Mark Cox because we do it in every session. But as my colleague and dear friend Mark Cox pointed out, in the situation of Log4j and OpenSSL Heartbleed, the open source ecosystem actually worked. It actually did what it was supposed to. The problem was the users. And I can certainly say that for Log4j, which I was very involved with in working with the US government and certainly our own teams. I mean, people were clueless about where it was, what they were supposed to do with it, were they using version 1, were they using which versions. I mean, the problem wasn't the open source ecosystem. It was taking in the information to be able to do what the communities couldn't do for you, okay? The communities did what they were supposed to do. My humble opinion is that I think one area of, and I use the word investment carefully because I don't think it's just monetary resources, is that I think the area of the open source ecosystem that has got to get more attention, and this was documented in the Atlantic Council's 2020 report on the software supply chain, was where everyone goes to get their open source, which are the warehouses. And I know that may be a controversial view, but let's say it, no one goes to the upstream communities to get their source code. They go to repositories. You don't know what's there. You don't know what's real. You don't know what's authenticated. That, to me, is a place for a serious public-private partnership in a constructive way to look at how to improve both at a technical level, and the Linux Foundation, Cisco, Google, Red Hat, and others have come together on something called SigStore, which is designed to be a very lightweight way of authenticating, but also in the process of creating better practices. It's not just a technology, it's just better practices. So that would be an area where I think looking at public-private partnership investment would have a very big payoff in the confidence, trustworthiness, and approach of how people feel about the open source ecosystem.
Excellent. Jim?
Yeah, I agree with Mark on that. One of the things, and I also agree that the tech industry is very hit-driven, right? You know, it was VMs were a thing, and then PaaS was a thing, and then containers were a thing, and now it's Web3 is a thing, and you always want to invest in the shiny new thing. So I completely agree with that, but you do want to make sure that you diversify enough that you have consistency as one thing goes up and one thing goes down. When it comes to the package managers and different repos, I do think there's an open data effort that at minimum, government has access to their own usage data of different software components. When we were trying to prioritize, and I'll give you a specific example where we did some data sharing, what open source projects really mattered. One of the hardest things to do is try and figuring out what's everybody using. And the best source of the data at the time was from companies like Sonatype, Synopsys, software composition analysis companies who through their customer relationships did have a pretty good inventory because those tools are being used to take inventory for end users of what was being used. But if you know what's being used by, in terms of popularity by vertical industry, because it tends to be different by vertical, and then you put on top of that a metric around exploitability or some other set of characteristics, now you really can start addressing some of this market failure around the folks that Ben's talking about, which is like, hey, this thing's being used everywhere. And this poor person who's trying to maintain this thing is not being helped in a way or compensated in a way. And so I think better liquidity of that data would be extremely helpful. And we're working in the US with what's called the vertical industry councils, which is a part of the federal government private public advisory boards to get that data.
I was just going to say, I absolutely agree, and it is something that I've personally been struggling with since about 2016. So I worked on a project called Libraries.io that gathers a broad picture of what software interdependency looks like in open source. And I'm now doing it again with a project called Ecosystems. But regardless of what I can do and the business partner can do with what's in open source, we see if we just look at, 50 million repositories across GitHub, GitLab, maybe SourceForge if they sort out the OAuth access at some point. We see probably 1/50th in terms of the usage that we see by package managers' download counts. So we know we've got 1/50th of the data, and we can show which packages are important. But it is all of these proprietary users that need some motivation to be able to share their information with a organization, an institution, in order to complete that picture that we can actually kind of build that together, because we'll need it. We'll need it when we start supporting these projects with financial support. There can't just be an infinite amount of money that goes, as it currently does, to a few projects, and we'll need a dampening function. We'll need to say, actually, we believe that this project, which is the most used project, now has enough support for what their goals are, and now we need to start kind of building down from there. So,
I'm going to stay with you if that's okay, Ben. You're on the spot again. I think we've probably got time for one more question before we go to the audience. And I'd like this to be I'd like to look at the positive for a second. So when we were having our briefing call on Friday, some of the statistics that you mentioned were quite surprising to me. You said that 20% of the digital economy in the UK is based on open source. Have I quoted you back to you correctly? Is that right?
Am I going to mortally offend you if I say no? I think you're talking about a piece of research that I did in the civic tech world. Okay. So this was built libraries and did this open source kind of big network connect diagram. And this was after, Trump election and Brexit and stuff, and did a bit of analysis. And we would just go to a civic tech conference. You guys are all really struggling with existence right now. And we just sort of said, look, from all of the software that you produce, if we say that anyone that contributed to any of these projects that we call the civic tech community, and we look at how much code you've also contributed to your dependencies, we saw something like a 16% amount in terms of number of commits. I know it's not perfect, but of that code was contributed by the civic tech community, which was brilliant. And then when we expanded that to all of open source, we saw that for the data that we tracked, around 6% of the total of open source for all of these I think it was the top 10,000 packages, was contributed by members of this civic tech community. So yeah, in those dark times, we're still able to deliver a message of, this group of people is having a massive impact on this kind of commons of open source code that we all kind of get benefit from. So.
And that is a really positive advantage that we have in the UK, right? That's something that we can capitalise on, and that's what I'm trying to get to. I mean, I noticed that Sal in the last talk, when everybody was asked, the one thing that government should do, I think, I'm going to quote Sal incorrectly now, but anyway, here goes. The UK could be a world leader in security. 200,000 well-trained security engineers in the next 5 years could make a massive difference and could put us as world leaders in that area. So I wonder, in open source more broadly, it's not a competition, but kind of is. How does the UK gain a competitive advantage? Jim?
By the way, I believe Sal was a lot more pessimistic than that. It wasn't the opportunity. If you don't get to 200K,
yeah, we all have to be outsourced.
You're going to outsource everything.
And dystopian futures and all the rest of it. I'm trying to avoid them.
So I do think there's a big opportunity in a couple of ways. One, open source developers tend to be the best developers. The pay scale, I think a big challenge for the UK is the pay scale for, and somebody mentioned this, for a 1% developer. That developer is just so much more productive than others. It starts at 7 figures at a lot of tech companies in the United States. It's a daunting number. I think the opportunity here is to train folks in a specific sector of technology where the UK can be very competitive. And again, I come back to this Israeli example. In the US, the White House wants to train 700,000 people. For that's the number in the US for what kind of cybersecurity workforce you need, 700,000 people. If I was going to be picking sectors where really effective training can happen in order to create very high-paying jobs here, cloud security would be one of my number one picks. It is one of the most underserved, highest demand, highest paid areas that you could get to right away. That just has a huge demand and tons of vacancies. Broader cybersecurity then from there. And then I think by encouraging at a young age people to participate in these open source communities, you would start to grow just through engagement with these 1% developers who are in those communities, a workforce that would be incredibly competitive.
Mark?
I really can't add more to what Jim said. I'll be honest, I haven't thought about the UK ecosystem itself in a long time. And there are a lot of dynamics going on in the UK right now that I don't feel like I have a...
Too many variables.
Did I say that politely enough? Thank you. Look, I think the strength of the UK is that it has always had a global worldview. For being in a contained island country, it had enormous power. I think that ability to understand global markets is still a core feature of UK businesses, based on the ones I talk to. I think making sure that one benefits from that legacy and that perspective is very key with whatever you do. This is not just a UK market, not even just really an EU market, but really, what are you doing for services? And I think, while the position of the UK in things like financial services is not what it was, there are some sectors where globally it is still very, very much a serious player. And I think about technologies and services in that context, in my humble opinion, is a good starting point. But that's a very rough, I want to emphasize, it's a very rough outline.
It, though. I'm going to take a bit of an executive decision. I should really come to Rebecca and Ben for a view on that last question, but instead of that, I'm going to open to questions from the floor, and I'm going to ask Ben and Rebecca to take those first couple of questions. So, I'm sure you're all dying to ask. Yes, over here. Press the button.
So, I've seen this problem on a funding perspective from both sides of the fence. So, I'm a chair of a project, and I see how the funding from member companies influences and affects the project moving forward. From a corporate perspective, I also see the position of, I'm being asked to fund yet more money into an entity for a project or for multiple projects, whatever else. What's the benefit? I think from a funding perspective for open source, there needs to be some form of playbook where projects and entities can articulate very clearly the benefit of the funding. Why do you need to be a member? Why do you need to fund specific additional components? Because from a corporate perspective, especially in the current climate, bean counters just go, too many zeros, cut it down by 3 zeros, and you might have something. It's like, well, yeah, I might as well just pay for that out of my own credit card kind of thing. But I'm not that generous because I'm a Scotsman. So it's how can we address that dichotomy of funding for projects where if you're in the project, you see where that benefit comes from, you see how that money gets used and the pros of it. Yet from the corporate side of things, it's just a sinkhole.
Yeah. It's kind of a wicked problem. Rebecca, thoughts?
Notice how I didn't say he's our treasurer. Thanks, Andy. And actually, I actually think the answer to that is us as foundations, as those intermediaries, as I rambled on earlier about, we know the communities best, and we are also equipped to talk to the corporates and the other big stakeholders. It's on us to be able to explain that better and to actually demonstrate impact, and that, X amount of zeros has been turned into X amount of benefit. Sometimes that's going to be qualitative rather than quantitative. But yeah, I think, that's something that I very much want the Rust Foundation to be pushing forward on over the next couple of years. And I think in terms of, as the foundation having a proper strategy as to where we're trying to get to, that will kind of help us prioritize funding, hopefully, will slightly professionalize how we can talk to our members, to potential members, about where their funding goes and exactly what they get for it.
I can't believe you brought your own conversational snipers. I was just going to say, I can talk for a long time about this, but number one, it sounds like you are coming from a place of responsibility or concern about security or other kinds of, corporate risk, which is great, because as we know, over the last kind of 5 years ago, we'd be having a discussion about sponsorship and donation, and that is already way down if you're talking about those conversations. So I think we're already getting there, so that we're having this conversation at this level about policy and about risk and about those kinds of things, so that's great. And then I would say from my side that, it's very difficult right now to find out what kind of impact your support is having on these projects. And also there is a risk that maybe you feel as a single entity or as a group of entities that you are pushing a project in a certain place. So we're trying to do all that we can to ensure with the projects that we host that they are able to convey what it is that they have in terms of ambition with their roadmap and what they actually need to actually achieve that. and then where their money is going. Like, one thing that we do that many others don't is we believe that being open about how you use your money in your project is one of the best ways of describing what kind of impact you're having. So we're doing what we can to make sure that that information is as open as your code.
I feel also obligated to answer this question.
I was gonna say.
Yeah. One, don't join. Like, there's not a single project that we host where you cannot participate because you're not a member. So don't join. If you don't see value, don't join, except for the Rust Foundation, which you should triple down on in terms of your investment. And I say that semi-seriously because Rust is at an early stage of its growth, and what you need to understand is what you're paying for. We have 780,000 developers who work on our projects every day. The payroll of that group of people is not what you're paying for. The development of the software itself, with the exception of Linus Torvalds, who I'll tell you makes about $2 million a year, which we pay. And he deserves every penny of it. But what we do is we build ecosystems around these technologies so they are sustainable over long periods of time. On the front end of the cycle, I'll give you an example. Google comes to us and says, we want to be in the cloud space. We have never run a virtual machine. We want to make containers the de facto standard. We want you to build that into that ecosystem. We will contribute Kubernetes, which is very valuable software for container orchestration, in exchange for that. We took that and then put on events, promoted the concept of cloud native computing. We went and trained developers through a curriculum, which the membership paid for, in order to get people to buy into that ecosystem. In exchange for that, they got a better way to build, deploy, and manage applications. That's what you were paying for. But if you don't find value in that, I definitely don't want to sell you something that you don't want to buy. But I definitely want your employees and your engineers to participate in these open source projects, and that should be super easy. It should be seamless. If our organization is not doing a good job of onboarding new developers and making it a welcoming community to people from underrepresented groups and bringing people in, we're not doing our job. We should not get paid.
So I think we've kind of run out of time pretty much, but I just want to thank the panel. Thank you so much. It's been really interesting, and I hope the audience got lots out of it. So if you could just join me in thanking Mark, Rebecca, Ben and Jim.